Hi everyone, so in this video what we're going to look at is the Timber's first year content, and then we're going to have a couple of exam questions to try and answer at the end of it. So basically the aim for today's video is to be able to understand what the different groups of timbers are, give examples of the different kinds of timbers and their uses, and then how they're converted and used. So key things you need to know about for the exam is what a hardwood is, and then give some examples, what a softwood is and give some examples, what the term man-made board actually is and then give examples, and then how do you actually take trees and how it's actually converted into usable timber. So first of all, can you just pause the video for a second, and then can you just see what hardwoods and softwoods you can name off the top of your head? So give yourself a minute to do that, pause the video, just make a little list how many you can come up with. Right, so typically you get things, most common ones, things like oak, mahogany, teak, pine. Those are the most common ones people come up with. You might not know exactly what group it belongs to, but these natural timbers that you're probably familiar with from secondary school. So we'll look at hardwoods first. So they come from deciduous trees. So those are trees that lose their leaves in the autumn. They are slow growing, and they are a lot more expensive. So the reason they're a lot more expensive, because they take a lot longer to grow, typically 100, 200 years or more, depending on the kind of wood you're looking at. Because it takes a lot longer to grow, there's less of it, and because of supply and demand, that automatically just means they are more expensive anyway. It's a lot more difficult to preserve these resources because it takes so long to grow. You do have a managed rainforest, but it's very hard to police and it's very hard to keep that crop going regularly. So examples that we grow in England, the most common ones are oak, ash and beech. Now, when on the other slide I actually to say some timbers you already knew, oak was probably the most common one, used a lot in furniture, things like oak furniture land, things like that. Beech is very commonly used in workshop benches because it's very dense, very hard wearing, very strong. And then typical ones that we import from overseas are things like teak and mahogany, and typically that's because it needs to come from a very hot environment, which we just don't have a consistent one in this country. So next is your softwoods. So they are from evergreen trees, so those trees that don't lose their leaves in the autumn. They grow relatively quickly, so 5-10 years, and they are relatively cheap compared to hardwoods. So 90% of England's softwoods come from countries like Norway, Sweden. We do get some from Canada as well, because they need a colder environment. Now we can grow some softwoods in this country, so we have things like larch, spruce and Scots pine. So pine are used really commonly in secondary school. If you ever made like a jewelry box or something like that in DT and you're given a light coloured piece of timber, odds were that was Scots pine. Scots pine is also typically what is your comes from Christmas trees. Now England's a bit of a funny country because we're kind of in that middle ground where we don't quite have a cold enough climate to grow softwoods properly, and we don't have the tropical climate for hardwood. So we can grow some, but most of ours has to get imported because we just don't have the climate for it or the space to actually grow it as well. So the main hardwoods that come up in the exam, things like birch, ash, oak, teak, mahogany and beech. So what I'd like to do is, can you pause the video on this screen, can you get your textbook out, and can you write down basically what each one of those are? Can you tell me what their properties are and the possible uses? Now the reason you need to know that is when you're ever given an exam question, a wooden product, it'll ask you what is this made on. You can never just say wood, it needs to be specific. That's the equivalent of like going to Tesco's and saying, can I buy some food please? You need to be very specific on what kind of timber it would be. And the reason that matters is because of the kind of properties that it has. So whatever you're making, you must make sure you've got the right materials that has the right properties to do what you want to do. Okay, so there's 6 key ones you need to know: birch, ash, oak, beech, mahogany and teak. So can you pause the video, make notes on that, and then I'll go on to the next slide. So next ones are your softwood. So same thing again, you got cedar, you got spruce, you got pine, larch and Douglas fir. So can you do the same thing again? Can you pause the video? Can you say what they are, their most common properties, and then possible uses for them as well? So the reason why hardwood and softwood differ, apart from just coming from different kind of trees, it's to do with the cell structure inside the tree itself. So with hardwoods, the cell, so if you look on the left hand side here, you've got, this is the cell structure within it, so it's quite thick. So actually where the sap is the white bit in the middle, so it's thick walls with narrow centers. So that means that water goes through the channel very, very slowly, so it's thick and dense. So that is why when you've got hardwoods, they are very dense material. Now dense material means that it's very hard, structurally strong, so if you hit it, it's not going to break very easily. So typically dense timbers will have grains that are very, very close together. And then your softwoods, you have got on the right hand side, so there's a lot more sap in the middle, so a lot more water gets through a lot easier, so that's why it grows a lot faster, because it lets the water pass through quicker. And also it's a lot less dense, the actual structure itself. That's why when you cut them down, the grain on these timber sheets will be a lot further apart. Doesn't mean they're weak, it just means that they are not as strong as hardwoods. So that is the cell structure behind hardwoods and softwoods. So this is just to show you just typically where the world's sources of hardwoods and softwoods come from. So as we said earlier, typically softwoods come from colder climates, Canada, Scandinavia, and then hardwoods come from warmer climates, things like South America, Africa, some parts of Europe, New Zealand, just because they have the right climate for it. Now, as I said, England, we do grow some of ours our own, but we don't have the strong enough climate either way to grow enough of it, so a lot of it is just imported. So FFC, so hopefully this is a logo, you've probably seen it before, but may not necessarily have known what it stands for. So what it stands for is Forest Stewardship Council. So typically, if you've ever been to a timber yard, or if you've ever had a piece of timber and you've seen the FFC logo sort of printed onto it, what that means, it's from a managed source. So they've kept supply and the stock of the trees well, so when they cut them down, they make sure they are growing well. They're not just cutting down rainforests and moving on. They are making sure that it's a renewable resource, it is constantly going. So nowadays, a lot of companies make sure the timber they're using is FSC approved, so they have to have those stamps on it. So what we're going to have a look at now is actually conversion. So the word conversion is to do with how you take the tree, and then how you actually take that and turn that into usable planks. So I'm going to show you in a second. There's a few main ways that this is done. So your first one is quarter sawn. So if you look at the diagram on the right hand side, so your tree, first of all, your log is cut into 4 quarters, and then what will happen is you'll be on a table saw and you'll cut down from the top down to the middle, and then you'll cut in from the side into the middle, and then you've got 2 usable planks that'll be moved to the side, they're used, and then you do the same again, down from the top, in from the middle, you've got another 2 usable planks, and you'll keep going until you reach the edge of the tree. Now obviously the first time you do it, the planks are going to be a lot wider, and the more times you do it, you're going to end up with smaller planks. They might just be used for other jobs, but quarter sawn is a very common way. It's a good use of the resources. You're using as much as the tree as physically possible. There are some conversion methods that are not really efficient with the use of the material. So plain sawn, relatively similar. Rather than cutting it into quarters to begin with, it's just put as a whole log, and it's put through a massive table saw, and it's just cut straight down. So if you see, again, depending on whereabouts in the tree it's cut, depends on how big the planks will be, but it is cut right across. And then you've got end grain sawn. So end grain sawn is probably the least efficient way to convert timber. It's becoming quite popular at the minute because people are doing this, and then they are like doing coffee tables where they're casting resin and things into it. It's down to preference really. Sometimes it'll be when they've done quarter sawn, or like they converted as much of it as possible and they got a little bit at the end. So typically it's almost like if you've got like a piece of cucumber or a carrot and you're just sort of chopping the end off over and over and over again. So it does have some of its uses. Some people like the aesthetic of it. Personally, I think it's a bit of a waste, but it is used, just not that commonly. So once you've converted it, it's then not just sold, it needs to be treated. So when it's first done, it's in its green size, so that's still got moisture in it. So with that moisture, it needs to be dried out. So imagine if you've like bought something from Tesco's like meat and it's massive, and then you cook it and it shrinks in size. Timber is the same thing. So it's swelled with the moisture that just naturally is in it from nature. It's then dry, so it's drying one of two ways. It's either just air drying, where it's just left out and it's dried naturally, or it is put in a kiln and dried that way. Now, putting it in a kiln will speed up the process, and then you can control the quality a bit better because you can set the temperature it will be at for a certain amount of time, so you know it will always dry the right amount of time. If you're just drying it naturally, sometimes if some bits are left longer, they will not always be the right sizes, but there will always be shrinkage once the moisture has been taken out of the timber. Because what you don't want to do, you never do any construction work with timber that's got moisture in it, because it is structurally weak, and once it dries out, it will then, if you put joints into it, it will fall apart. So what we're looking at now is a couple of different faults that you will find in timber. So you've got knots along the top. So knots are typically those big black or brown spots you'd find in wood, and that is where the branches have come out of the tree, and they're very, very strong, but if you try and cut into it, it will split the whole wood. So typically, if you're ever in construction, you're making a product out of natural timbers, you try and avoid the knots. So if you're sort of turning a piece of timber on a lathe and there was a knot, it's quite risky, so it's always better to try and use a different piece. You've got splits, so that might be either in the middle or on the edging. Typically it might be from drying too quickly, because it's drying too quickly and the moisture has sucked out of it and it's sort of pulled apart. You've then got things like warping, which can be the same thing. So it can bow, warp, or it can cup. So all those, basically, if you put the timber flat on the table, it will no longer be flat. It will sort of rock side to side. So that depends on, again, how it's been dried. So whether it's been clamped down, compressed tightly, so it's dried on one side, or if it's been pulled apart. So that's why it's important typically to use kiln drying, because you can sort of reduce the possible effects of some of this splitting. Because if you get timber and it splits, essentially it's useless. So the last kind we're going to look at is manufactured boards. So the most common ones you'll have are plywood, chipboard, and MDF. There are three different groups of plywood. Plywood's a very popular one, used a lot in construction. But again, can you please pause the video? Can you just, with your textbook, note down those three types of manufactured boards, their properties, and then their potential uses? Okay, so that is natural timbers. Can you now? There are 6 questions. What I would like to do is, using your notes, using your textbook as well, can you pause the video and try and answer those questions? Once you've done that, I'll put the answers on the board, on the video for you as well. Okay, so explain the difference between air seasoning and kiln seasoning. So air seasoning is inexpensive, so you basically stack the timber in a shelter and allow the air to circulate around, so that will just dry naturally. Kiln seasoning is more expensive because you need to have the kiln and the space for it, but it's a lot quicker, sorry. The timber is then placed in a kiln and the air is controlled and the moisture is taken out that way. It's a lot faster, much more efficient way of doing it. Why is it important to season timber? Because without seasoning it, you can lead to cracking, warping, twisting, and it just becomes useless. You can't make any money from it. Which timber will be used for tool handles and why? Something like ash, because it's tough. It's the same with when you have things like work benches, you have beech because it's hard wearing. So which timber could be used for outdoor furniture? Typically oak would be the most common one. Teak if it's a quite expensive one, or larch. So what's the difference between hardwoods and softwoods? Hardwoods take a lot longer to grow and are therefore more expensive. And then why are veneers used? So they give an attractive finish to a cheaper piece of material. So if you had a sheet of MDF, you could have a veneer, like an oak veneer over the edge of it, so you'd have a very, very thin layer of oak stuck on the top of MDF, so it looks like an expensive piece, but then really it isn't. So that is the basic introduction to timbers. If you've got any questions, send me an email and I'll try and answer them for you.